So I think California consumers are likely going to be in an environment where not only are they going to see increasing upward pressure on prices, but they're also probably going to see more volatile prices around that rising gasoline price.
If there was a plan from the state that's kind of outside of the box, the CEC, California Energy Commission, had some recommendations, and one of them was this one, to operate the refineries. Is there any other thoughts that could be viable besides this one?
They put about 12 suggestions out there, and one of them that actually might have some traction was the idea of, instead of the state running refineries, that the state becomes an importer of gasoline. So the state of California actually goes out into the global market and buys gasoline volume, and it brings it into the state on a ratable basis. Now, there's going to be a logistic issue about, well, when you offload that gasoline, where are you going to put it? But let's suppose that, let's park that.
So no storage.
That can be, yeah, there's going to be a storage issue, but let's park that and say that we can solve. Would that, could that be a more cost-effective way for the state of California to guarantee sort of that supply of gasoline we've lost because a refinery is shut down? We, the state of California, will go into the market, and we're just going to be a large buyer of gasoline. Now, you're going to be known to be a large buyer of gasoline, and there's some issues around that. But those trading issues can be managed. Is that a more cost-effective way for the state to sort of say, I'm going to make sure that there's this reliable supply of gasoline that comes in, because I'm going to become one of the importers. The state of California, will become one of the importers of gasoline, and they would bring that gasoline and then they would sell it to somebody in the wholesale market. And the state of California wouldn't need to own retail service stations. They could sell it to a wholesaler who would then move it to the retail service stations, just like the existing system does. That was one of the ideas that they proposed, and there might be something in there maybe that's something to look at, because one of the advantages that brings is, as the demand for gasoline goes down and you're closing refineries in California, if the state's operating a refinery, how and when is the state going to close a refinery, given that there are other refineries around it? The other refineries are closing. If you're buying gasoline, at some point, that's much easier to wind down, because you just let contracts expire. You have these long-term contracts, you just let the contracts expire, and the volume will just naturally compress down to what you need. That actually would be an easier process to manage exiting. It would be a lot easier for the state to exit trading gasoline than it would be for the state to exit owning and operating a refinery.
Now, is it normal for a state to get into the operation of buying gasoline and buying oil, or is it usually private companies do that?
It's in the world, the vast majority of it is private companies that's done. I mean, where you do see government-owned refineries are the national oil companies that are predominantly in the countries, the OPEC member countries. So, countries like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela. Where you do see it is where not just the refineries, but the entire petroleum industry has been nationalized. And now the government has a company that owns the entire industry within that country. What you can say about government-owned refineries, they don't run very well. There is a big difference between what you can see is, even within the same country, the government-owned refineries do not operate as well as the privately owned refineries in the same country. We're seeing that right now in Nigeria, where the refineries owned by the Nigerian National Oil Company, they operate at about 20 to 30% utilization. The brand new Dangote refinery that was built by a private entrepreneur, that refinery is operating at about 65 to 70%.
Wow.
And rising, right? Because the reason why it's operating at 70% is because they're still starting this refinery up. But they're already able to demonstrate that within the same country, the private sector can operate a refinery 3 times better than the national oil company does. And we see that across the country, across the world, wherever you look at, with the exception of Saudi Arabia and probably Kuwait, refineries in most government-owned refineries do not operate nearly as well as as the nearest private sector refinery operating in the same jurisdiction or in the same region. That's something that the state of California needs to take, is that there's something about this, that the private sector just operates these assets better than a government-owned sector. If the state of California wanted to get into operating refineries, They need to be realistic about it and ask themselves, what are they going to do differently than all these other government-owned refineries that have much lower utilization rates? How would they actually operate it differently and expect to get a different result? You know, that's another reason why the state owning a refinery is a really complex issue. And I think a lot of homework has to get done before I would encourage the state, there's a lot of homework to be done before you make this move, because they're big moves and they're expensive moves. And they just need to keep it in mind that when you look at the rest of the world, you don't see a lot of government-owned operating success in this industry. You normally see the best assets are operated by private sector companies. If the state were interested in getting into the refining business, right, the best thing they could do is to take a refining that's already operating and acquire that asset. So for example, the Phillips 66 refinery in LA is going to close in October. If the state's serious about getting into refining, that's probably an asset to look at, because the current owner is willing to separate themselves from it, and it's an operating asset, so everything is working today. And that's going to be the easiest and best case for the state to come in and own a refinery, is to own one that's already operating well.
Now, are the current owners leaving, just like they're just giving it up, or do the state have to buy it? Does the state have to buy it?
I guess the state would have to buy it, because one of the things that Phillips 66 is doing is they are doing a redevelopment strategy with a real estate development
to change that company to something
and say,
else.
what would we do with this? What would we do with this site if it wasn't a refinery? What would we do with it? And so they have plans. They will not be operating a refinery on that site. They aren't leaving the state of California, because Phillips 66 still has service stations. It still has their renewable diesel plant near San Francisco. But they're going to do something different with that
So
acreage.
the state has to still invest a good amount to get into this business.
So the state would still have to invest something. I don't think there's any way you could see that Phillips 66 would just part with it for free, because the land is worth something. And Phillips 66 is saying, if it's not a refinery, what is it? And we're going to figure out how do we redevelop and repurpose that land for something else. Suppose it does happen. Well, the state now is taking over an operating asset. And that's the best place to be in refining, something that's already operating and manageable, with an employment base, with workers who actually understand that asset. Because if you close that refinery, those people are going to wander off to other jobs. Now, if you wanted to reopen it a few years later, you're going to be hiring in people.
Does it cost a lot more to do that?
It's going to cost a lot more, because it's been out of operation, so there will be things that just haven't been maintained because you weren't operating. That work is going to have to be done. And you're going to have to hire a workforce to operate that refinery. You're not going to get the same workforce that you had when it was in operation. So, you know, there is this sweet spot, for lack of a better term, for the state of California, if they're serious about doing it.
To do it with the one that's closing
There is
down.
an asset that's available right now that is operational, and the owner is willing to separate from it. So there is an opportunity. There would be an opportunity, but that opportunity is about
It's
6
only
months
6
left.
months.
Yeah.
So it might be hard for them.
It might be very hard to put that deal together.